I guess the first question are tactics to get there. And just as the destruction of apartheid in South Africa essentially became an economic campaign, yes, I guess the first question is how we're going to get there. And just as the tactics that were used to dismantle apartheid in South Africa were primarily economic, I'm wondering if you could explicate a little bit about what you see as those forces of nonviolent forces of coercion that will bring Israel to a settlement.
Well, so far, and our experience is relatively limited, I think, there hasn't been an organized mass movement or even a sophisticated movement that's been trying to reach a public. Too much in the past has been sloganeering, and sloganeering of a very infantile sort, of which I'm as guilty as anyone else. I remember in the 1980s when I first got involved, we used to walk down the streets of New York warily, chanting slogans like, "Everybody should know I support the PLO." Well, it rhymed, but it was not going to reach a broad public in New York. Actually, the challenge was not to get killed between the beginning and the end of the demonstration. It was a kind of death wish slogan. There have been basically in recent times three kinds of tactics that have been attempted. One you can call trying to use the law, and the apogee, the peak of that tactic came after the Goldstone report, the report which indicted Israel or alleged that Israel had committed significant war crimes and crimes against humanity during its attack on Gaza in 2008 and 9. And the basic form it took was using the provision in international law, which is called universal jurisdiction. Namely, there are certain crimes which, if committed, any national government can prosecute them, even if they weren't committed by a national of that country. And so Israel had a very hard time, and they were very worried, because none of their representatives, none of their, so to speak, ambassadors, were able to travel anywhere because all of them were de facto war criminals. And that put a real fear in the hearts of the Israelis. Unfortunately, that tactic kind of expired with Richard Goldstone's infamous recantation. The second tactic that's been tried with some success has been various forms of nonviolent civil disobedience. The peak of that tactic came with the Mavi Marmara, the vessel which attempted to breach Israel's illegal blockade of Gaza, in the course of which 9 passengers were martyred. That shined a very bright light on Israel's egregious crimes against the people of Gaza. That tactic also reached, I won't call it a dead end, but its success largely depended on the backing of a strong state, in this case Turkey, which, because it was a vessel, the Mavi Marmara, holding mostly Turks, and 8 of the 9, all 9 passengers were Turks. One of the 9 was an American and a Turk, dual citizenship. Turkey played a very forceful role in holding Israel accountable for the killings on the Mavi Marmara. But the next year, namely this past year, when it was an attempt to repeat that tactic, Turkey backed out at the last minute, and the tactic basically, it floundered. It didn't go anywhere. And the third tactic that's been tried goes under the heading of BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which also has had varying amounts of success, not nearly as much success as it's sometimes claimed by its leaders and proponents, but certainly in certain cases it's proven to be effective. So I would say those are the three main tactics that have been tried so far with the varying amounts of success. My opinion is, as I've tried to convey this evening, if we can clearly articulate the goal, each of those tactics, its success rate will be vastly increased. Because people, for example, if you say, we want you to boycott Israeli products, they obviously say, why and until when? Why? Okay, because Israel is committing major crimes, human rights crimes and so forth. And then you say, until when? And when it comes to until when, the BDS movement or its leadership is kind of ambiguous about when. They say until Israel ends the occupation, that's clear. Until the Palestinian refugees have a right of return, that's clear. But then they tack on a third demand, until there's an end to Israeli apartheid, as they put it. And that's kind of ambiguous. When you say Israeli apartheid, are you talking about the dismantling of the system Israel has created in the occupied territories, which can, in my opinion, and not just my opinion, but the opinion of many people, I can list if you like, constitutes a system which is very much like apartheid. But ending in Israeli apartheid can also be interpreted as meaning dismantling Israel. And that's not going to fly. Again, I'm not talking about issues of morality or ethical, what's more ethical. It simply has no possibility, in my opinion, of reaching a broad public. So I think at this point, the most important item on our agenda is we have to unify ourselves around a goal which no reasonable person in public can find reproachable. That's what we need to do.
You, in the manuscript that I was reading of your new book, talked about the deterioration within the Israeli political establishment. At one point, you mentioned Abba Eban, the former foreign minister who had 3 firsts at Cambridge, and today we have Avigdor Lieberman, whose origins began as a bouncer at a nightclub in Moldova. A similar kind of deterioration has happened within the American political establishment. One completely corrupted by money. The inability on the part of the citizen to find redress within the Congress. Given these two deteriorations, both within Israel and within the United States, given a lack of Abba Ebans, or King Hussein's, or Yitzhak Rabin's, doesn't this make any kind of a movement much more difficult because finally they're not beholden to the concerns of the public?
Well, I don't think the comparison is exact. In the case of Israel, if you make broad generalizations, but in my opinion, generalizations which contain a kernel of truth, Israel now resembles, in its body politic, it very much resembles the Deep South during the Civil Rights Movement. It is, and I'm not saying this in a pugnacious way, it is mean country. It is a very tough nut to crack right now. And in terms of comparisons, you could say the civil rights movement, its main dynamic was the demand of African Americans that the law of the land, in particular the Supreme Court decision Brown versus Board of Ed, the law of the land had to be enforced in the South. And the demand that was made was that the federal government had to enforce the law in the South. And that meant breaking the back, not physically, but certainly politically, breaking the back of a phalanx of white supremacy and just ugliness. And similarly, I think, the challenge now in the Israel-Palestine conflict is it's the law of the international community, as I described it, I think accurately, that now has to be imposed on Israeli society, and politically its back needs to be broken. It too is a very mean country. On the other hand, in the United States, I think it's true that there is a broad public, maybe, as the young people say, reaching up to 99% of the American people who don't like the way our government and that tiny handful have been and are carrying on. And so I think it's a different picture. Here we have a very real possibility of mobilizing a broad public to try to, if we can use the religious language, to try to redeem our country. And it's a very hopeful moment. It's not going to come from up on high. Mr. Obama is presently in his populist mode, one of the most cynical, not to mention stupefyingly narcissistic politicians in our time. If you listen to his speech today in Kansas, he's now playing the populist mode. I happen to listen only and exclusively to right-wing radio. I like hate radio, as we call it in New York, W-Hate BC. And I listen to Mr. Hannity and Mr. Limbaugh, and there's this character named Ms. Crowley. She comes on Sunday, and she was interviewing this Democratic strategist, and he's also a right-winger. He calls himself a Democrat. Doug Schoenfeld, I think is his name. Doug Schoen. And she asked him, I don't understand, Mr. Obama. He's attacking Wall Street, but he's getting all of his money from Wall Street. So how does he expect to get money? And this guy says, it was probably the only true thing that came out in that particular program, actually the only true thing that comes out of the whole station. He said because his whole tactic is he winks at Wall Street and says, guys, you know I have to say this to get elected. After I get elected, it's back to business as usual. We're not going to get anything from them. It'll be back to business as usual. This particular cynical tactic works. But from the American people, I'm pretty hopeful now. It's a wonderful thing that happened with the Occupy movement. The young people are really very inspiring, deeply inspiring. You see 22-year-olds who are 22 going on 40. They speak with such maturity, such intelligence, such commitment. It's a deeply moving sight. But I don't think that can really be said in Israel. In Israel, it's really a very tiny minority, and they're the first to tell you they're a tiny minority. If you ask Gideon Levy or Mira Haas, do they represent anyone in Israel? They'll tell you no.